Welcome and thanks for joining me as we continue our deep dive into Jonah. Today we'll be covering Jonah 1:3, Jonah's descent to Joppa, his flight to Nineveh, and his flight from God, ultimately, who he's fleeing from. And so before we get started, take a minute and like this video, subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a lot, lets people know that you enjoy this content, lets YouTube know you enjoy this content, and lets other people see it as well. So without further ado, let's get started. In the previous two verses, we had learned that the word of the Lord had come to Jonah and given him a directive to go to the city of Nineveh because their destruction had come up before, and we learned about the size of Nineveh and its importance and why God may have wanted to send Jonah there. And so in this verse, we find Jonah's response to that directive. And unlike any other prophet before him that I know about, Jonah runs away from God. So not only does he run away from God, he descends, he goes down. And so the first place he goes down to is Joppa. Then he goes down to the ship, so down to the docks at Joppa, which is a city on the coast of the Mediterranean. And then he goes down into the ship, right? And then he goes down into the bowels of the ship. So we're going to cover all of that today. We're going to talk about his descent into disobedience, his descent into the ship. Ultimately, Jonah, though, was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And he says as much later in the text. He tells the sailors that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And that's an odd thing to say to them. They were very concerned, given that he also let them know that Yahweh was the God of heaven and earth, creator of dry land and the seas, right? And so when the storm comes upon them, they're a little bit shaken up whenever they know that, because they know that he is running from this God who has dominion over the seas and has this dominion over the dry land. And so this descent is more than just a physical descent. It's more than geographical descent to a lower plane on the earth. It's more than that. It's more than going down into a valley or going down to the coastline. It's actually a theological descent as well. We know that God lives in the heavens, so he walks on the vault of the heavens, as we're told in the scriptures. And oftentimes people meet with God on mountains. And so going up is associated with God. The sky is associated with God, whereas going down and descending is associated with death and is associated with disobedience as well. So Jonah's descent is not just physical, it's just not just practical, it's also a theological descent, in that as he goes down, he's running from God. So let's look at that a little more closely. Job 22:14 tells us that thick clouds veil him so that he does not see, and he walks on the vault of the heavens. And as we mentioned before, the mountains are the abode of God. Ezekiel 28:13 says, "You were an anointed guardian cherub, I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked." So this is where God lives, is on this holy mountain. And I believe that the garden also exists on that mountain, at least theologically. And so this is where God is this mountain. It's high, it's above, it's up, right? Not down. And so there's an interesting thing actually going on here in this verse in Ezekiel. I read to you out of the English Standard Version. I want to read real quickly to you out of the New Living Translation as well. So New Living Translation says, I ordained and anointed you as a mighty angelic guardian. ESV again says, you were anointed guardian cherub. So there's an interesting translational choice there. And this doesn't have to do with our discussion. I just thought it was interesting because we've talked about Bible translations, but the NLT is a more free translation. It's a more thought for thought translation. But actually, in this case, I think it's more accurate. It's more detailed, because instead of just writing the word cherub, which is what we call a transliteration, where they just take the Hebrew word and the sounds that it makes and turn that into English, it is actually a translation. That this is the the mighty angelic guardians. We have this picture of cherubs in our heads, these little guys with the bow and arrow, and shoot you and you fall in love with somebody, or whatever. Well, that's not a cherub. A cherub is a vastly different thing, is a vastly more powerful entity that is really a throne guardian. It is a guardian of the garden of God in this case as well. And so interesting little translational thing there. It's one of the reasons it's so important to look at a couple different translations whenever we're doing our Bible study, whenever we're doing any kind of research or trying to understand a passage on a deeper level. It's not so much that one's better than the other. It's that one kind of comes at things from a different angle than the other. Now, back to our discussion of Jonah 1:3, and we're going to start with Tarshish and where it might have been located. So one way we can go about this is by looking at Genesis 10. So Genesis 10:4, which lists off the sons of Javan, okay? And so Tarshish is one of those sons, and the other three are Elisha, Kittim, and Dodanim. So they're listed along Tarshish in Genesis 10:4. So Elisha is mentioned in conjunction with a blue and purple awning for a ship in Ezekiel 27:7. Okay. Kittim is associated with Cyprus. Okay. And in First Maccabees also associates Kittim with Macedonia. Okay. And it reads, after Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim. Okay, so Kittim. This is what we're talking about. So Macedonia, which Macedonia is to the northwest, right? Josephus also mentions that the sons of Japheth settled from the Taurus Mountains and Amanus and moved along Asia Minor and through Europe to Cadiz, which is in Spain. So in short, really kind of most of the northern coast of the Mediterranean is in view for where all of these sons would have settled, according to the biblical account. Okay, so Kittim, though, specifically is associated with Cyprus by Josephus. He writes this. He says, Kittimus possessed the island of Kithima. It is now called Cyprus, and from that it is that all islands and the greatest part of the seacoasts are named Kittim. Okay, so all islands and the greater part of the seacoast are named Kittim. So this broader region is Kittim. Okay, so possibly those islands of Greece and Crete and all of those. And so lastly, we have Dodanim, which is primarily associated with the island of Rhodes, which is in the same general area. So Tarshish's location is undefined. We don't know exactly where it is. Okay, some think also it may have been in Carthage, which is in North Africa. Others think it may be on the coast of Spain, as we talked about before. Jeremiah 10:9 tells us that beaten silver is brought from Tarshish. Okay, and as well as other metals. Tarshish did business with you because of your great wealth of every kind. Silver, iron, tin, and lead they exchanged for your wares. Okay, Isaiah 23:1 is an oracle concerning Tyre, and it also mentions Tarshish. It says, wail, O ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is laid waste. So we do know where Tyre was. We still don't know where Tarshish is, but apparently it had significant trading relations with the city of Tyre in metals and other valuable goods. So we also know of a purpose-built fleet of ships that Solomon built. Okay, and so the scripture reads, for the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the fleet of ships of Tarshish used to come, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Okay, so these ships of Tarshish were sort of a purpose-built fleet of Solomon's. And so This doesn't necessarily mean that those ships came from Tarshish to bring those trade goods. What it does mean is this is the type of ship that Tarshish would have used in their trading operation. So it's more of a class of ship, like we have a battleship or a frigate, right? Or a cruiser, and so this is more like that, or perhaps a better analogy would be a Spanish treasure galleon, right, which was specifically made to haul treasure, right, and go on these long voyages. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying it was a Spanish galleon, that it was that large or that it had cannons on it, right? you know, but what I am saying is it was a purpose-built trading ship that was known as a ship of Tarshish. So Tarshish is associated with trade and maritime trade specifically, and coastline specifically, islands and those sorts of things. So while we don't know exactly where Tarshish is, we do know with a fair amount of certainty that it would have been located somewhere probably on the northern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and that it was strongly associated with trade, specifically trade in precious metals and goods, which kind of leads me to my point, right? Is that Jonah, when he descended into Joppa and he finds this ship bound for Tarshish, kind of in my mind makes me think that he really was just trying to get out of there, right? And so I think Southwest Airlines had this type of flight called a fly anytime or fly anywhere flight. It was just dirt cheap. You could get them anytime, and there weren't any frills, and you could just go where you wanted to go. And so there wasn't like this big thought process of like, well, okay, I'm going to go resettle in Tarshish and I'm going to go there because, the job market is good and all of this stuff. It was more just, hey, this is the sort of the first ship he came across, and sort of by the law of averages, it was a ship bound for Tarshish because A, it's a coastal city, and B, it does a lot of trade in that area. It's very prominent in the trading networks in that area. So while the destination of Jonah's flight is somewhat blurry, we don't necessarily know where Tarshish is, the reason for his flight is pretty clear. So he's fleeing from the presence of the Lord. He's fleeing from the face of God. In Hebrew, that's milifnei, okay, with the fnei there, indicating the face, right? And we see this occur in several different places in the Bible. We're not going to go crazy in depth in this, but we are going to look at a couple of them. So one common example where this is used is in Exodus 33:14, where the Lord says, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." My presence there, my face will go with you, my front will go with you, right? And I will give you rest, right? And that's in the Exodus narratives with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire and all of these things. So that's his presence, that's his pene, right? So beyond that, perhaps a little more interesting, at least to me, is that the bread placed in the tabernacle is called the bread of the presence. So 1 Kings 7:48 is a reference for that. Okay. And that's lehem hapanim, right? So you hear the pan there, that's the face. So the lehem panim, the bread of face, right? Or the bread of the presence. And so interesting parallel here is that the presence of God, so strongly displayed in the Exodus narratives, then comes to rest in the tabernacle, in the temple. And Jonah then is running from that. So Jonah is really running from the central element of what it means to be a Hebrew, what it means to be a follower of God, the presence of God, the face of God. That's what he should be striving for, especially as a prophet, is to be in the presence of God. If you watched a few videos ago, and we talked about part of the prophet's job description was to be in the court of God. It was to be where God was, to hear his directives, to get um, directions from him and hear what his judgments were and then report those to the people. So Jonah is definitively running from his calling and definitively running from his identity here. So finally, we look at Jonah's actual descent. And I think this is a key to understanding this. Jonah goes down to Joppa, as we said, he goes down into the ship, he goes down into the bowels of the ship, but ultimately he falls asleep in the ship, which is important. He enters into a deep slumber. And so this is Vayerdam. So that's the Hebrew word there. And we have a couple other places where this occurs. Jael in Judges, whenever he gets ended, he is said to be in that type of sleep. That's the word that's used for that. So it's a very deep sleep, probably almost unconsciousness. So a couple examples. Genesis 2:21 uses the noun form. It says, "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to follow on the man." Psalm 76:6. "At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both rider and horse lay stunned." Okay, so lay stunned. That's the word here that's used for what happens to Jonah. So that's why I say it's almost more like unconsciousness, right? He's stunned. He's knocked out, and especially there, I think also in Genesis that Adam or the man was put into such a deep slumber that something was able to be pulled out of him. The surgery, as it were, was able to be done on him, and the woman was created from out of him as a help. And so that had to have been an incredibly deep sleep, a deep sleep. And I think this is the key here, brought on by God. And so now that's not definitively said in our text that it's brought on by God, but I think we might be able to take a little liberty there and think that it is, because this is part of what it is for Jonah to be running away from God. That now not only is he running from God, not only is he fleeing from God, but now he's not even really conscious. He's not even really capable. He's not in his, I don't want to say in his right mind, but he doesn't have his faculties to even do what God has asked him to do, right? And the irony, I think, of Jonah is that the sailors cry out, right? Whereas the prophet does not. So very, very interesting there. And so moving along, we then finally see Jonah crying out from the belly of the fish, this being his final descent, right? So he goes into the fish, and then the fish goes down, right? And goes down even to the depths of the earth, to the foundations of the earth. And he cries out and says this, "Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice." Sheol there being the place of the dead, the place where people go when they die. So Jonah is said to have descended into the depths, into the pit, where the bars of the earth close up over him, which is almost, I think, descending and going back into a state of uncreation. So it's not even so much physical death, it's going back to a place that existed sort of, I don't want to say before creation, but pre what we know as creation, right? And Genesis says that the earth was formless and void, right? And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep, right? And so that sort of formless and void area, I think, is kind of what's in view here. And so Jonah is going back into a place where before God had really even acted on the earth to bring order from chaos, right? And so pretty deep stuff, right? And so he's descended all the way there in his flight from God, and he's succeeded. And so even in that sense, he has fled from God, because that would be about as far from God as you can get, is that place where God hasn't even interacted in such a way with the earth to bring order to it. right? And so, yes, Jonah has fled intensely from the Lord. But what does this all mean? Jonah's decisions took him away from the presence of the Lord. They took him down into the depths, down to death, down into an unconscious, uncreative malaise that really he could never have gotten out of on his own. And in a sense, he really did die because he couldn't have gotten any further from the presence of God. But ultimately, it's not the decisions of Jonah that we're going to focus on. It's not the decisions that Jonah made that is the point of this little series, but it's the reason why he made those decisions that we're going to focus on. And the reason why he made those decisions is what we're going to cover in our next video. So please join me for that. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you next week.